Let's jump in to our text for today. If you want to push pause here and read the psalm for today, you can open your Bible to Psalm chapter 52. Well, Psalm chapter 52 reads a lot like one of my journal entries. Maybe you are like me, or maybe you're much nicer than me. But my journal entries, especially when I used to journal a lot, would begin with just venting everything. So-and-so doesn't like me, and so-and-so is doing bad things to me. I don't feel good. All of this stuff that's the chaos that's happening in my life. But typically, if you read an entire journal of mine, you would start to see a pattern. There's this pattern of just dumping. And then all of a sudden, it's like I feel better. Whew. And then I transition to journaling about gratitude and feeling called in ways to love more and appreciation for all that I have and grateful that I have a God that will listen to my cries. And who will hear me and who sees me in my very raw and complex humanity. Well, this psalm is very like that. But we really can't understand the psalm, and it uses pretty action-oriented, kind of violent language. But we can't understand the psalm unless we know the story behind it. So let's look at the story behind this psalm. It can be found in 1 Samuel chapter 22. And here in verse 5, we join King Saul under the tamarisk tree. Now, King Saul is under the tamarisk tree, and this tamarisk tree is on a hill, and this hill is located in his hometown of Gibeah. Now, King Saul is sitting under this tamarisk tree holding a sword. Now, you and I, as the readers of 1 Samuel, are clued into the fact that Saul's leadership is being questioned. It's kind of coming to an end because he's descending into paranoia and madness. Well, as King Saul is sitting under the tamarisk tree holding his sword, his men, or the guards around him, come to tell him that they have found David and David's men. Well, King Saul responds and immediately yells at his men, "Why have you conspired against me? Is David able to give you power and land like I did? Why didn't you tell me about the covenant between my son Jonathan and David?" And then he kind of sits there and he shifts to being a little pouty baby and he says, "Nobody cares about me." Well, enter a new character, Doeg the Edomite. Now, we know in the chapter before, chapter 21, that Doeg the Edomite has information, a tidbit of gossip about David that he wants to share with King Saul. So he feels like this is the perfect moment. So he says, "King Saul, I have this gossip that I want you to hear about David." And Saul's eyes get wide, like, "Yeah, lean in, I want to hear this." And so Doeg the Edomite says, "I saw the priest Ahimelech inquire of the Lord on behalf of David." Now, that's enough that we probably assume that King Saul, who is quick to anger, his anger level is beginning to rise, his blood pressure is growing. But Doeg says, "Oh, but that's not all. Ahimelech also gave David food and water and the sword of Goliath." So King Saul is quick to anger, and he turns to his men and he says, "Go bring me Ahimelech and his entire family, who are all priests in the city of Nob." And so Ahimelech and his family, all the priests in the city of Nob, arrive in front of King Saul, and King Saul says, "Why have you done this?" And Ahimelech is a little bit disturbed, like, "Done what?" David is a trusted man. David is head of the bodyguards. David is actually your son-in-law and is very well respected. And then he gets a little bit snarky with the king and says, do you think that I haven't done this before? Of course, the answer is, of course he has. Of course he's done these things for David before. And so King Saul, poor King Saul, responds as we think he will. And so he turns to his soldiers, he turns to his guards, and he says, kill all of them. But much to his surprise, no one moves. It's kind of like we can imagine the soldiers looking at each other like, ooh, is he in his right mind? And probably they're all thinking, we do not want the blood of priests on our hands. And so there's a long enough pause where King Saul notices nobody's moving, nobody's obeying. And so he turns to Doeg and he says, you do it. And Doeg the Edomite does. Now, some translations tell us that Doeg killed 85 that day. Another translation says 305. And Josephus, the historian, tells us that Doeg killed 385 that day. Now, the rest of the text goes on to tell us that Doeg not only killed Ahimelech and his family, but he went to Nob and killed the men and the women and the children and the infants and all the livestock. But we as the readers are privileged to know that in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 33, a prophecy was made about this time. And in the prophecy, it said that one would survive. And in fact, one did. He was the son of Ahimelech, a priest, and his name is Abiathar. So after all this happens and he survives, he runs to David and he tells him all that has happened. And as a good leader does, David responds and says, I am responsible. Come and stay with me. You will be safe with me. Well, this is the background story behind Psalm chapter 52. So now that we know more of the story, we can read more with more clarity and see what the psalm has to say. First, we find in the psalm that David is stunned at what the mighty one has done. Now, the mighty one can be Doeg or the mighty one can be Saul. That fits both. I kind of agree with the commentators who say it's Doeg. But he declared that Doeg has acted treacherously and that he's done these things not having inquired of the Lord, but only seeking King Saul's approval. What is even more stunning is that Doeg is apparently running around boasting about what he has done and is saying, hey, I'm going to do other evil things. So he's plotting more evil. Well, this psalm is David's opportunity to vent, to get it all out, to vent frustration and anger and sadness and just wishing that he had not put Ahimelech and his family in that position. It's his opportunity to let God in on just the complexity of emotion that we humans feel in different experiences. But kind of like in my journal entry, David quickly moves to trust. Trust in that God's will be done, that God's justice will be made known on this earth. And so he trusts so much that this will happen that he says, I'm just going to rest. I don't need to take revenge, which is pretty interesting because the mentor that he had in King Saul was somebody who took revenge at every opportunity. And so David could have just easily fallen that pattern. But he says, nope, God's justice will be made known. And then he uses very active verbs to describe how God's justice will be done. He says that God will break, snatch, tear, and uproot. And then in comparison to the one that God will break, snatch, tear, and uproot, David will get to see the justice of God. David will act in humility, and David will transform this suffering into joy. Well, there's a pause. Anytime you see the Selah, that's a pause for a breath. A pause for you and I, the reader, to ask some questions, to see what questions are bubbling up. And I had some questions like, well, how can David trust that Saul will eventually meet God's justice? And why does David rest from seeking revenge himself? And David then quickly, once we end our pause and take our breath and ask our questions, David answers. He says, because those who trust God are like a green olive tree who do not easily disappear. They have long life and they cannot be uprooted. Saul sits under the tamarisk tree, and David compares himself to an olive tree. Well, what's between the two trees? First, let's talk about the two trees. A tamarisk tree has these beautiful, vibrant plumes. They're like hot pink leaning to red. And the tamarisk tree was also seen as a symbol between God and the people, a symbol of the covenant. It was a reminder of God's enduring promise that God would never leave us alone. Now, this covenant was based upon God's actions, God's presence, and God's power. But the olive tree was a reminder that God's people are to act in ways that are righteous, that God's people have a responsibility for the gift of the land that God has given them. David uses the olive tree to say that by dwelling close to God, by taking refuge in God, which by that he means walking the path, he says that he, even in these challenging times, feels like he is flourishing. Well, here we see the transition of the axial period taking place. The axial period was a time in which the Psalms were composed. And so during this time, you see a lot of transition of thought within our religious tradition. We have King Saul clinging to the covenant that God has made, and the other king to be acknowledging personal choice and personal responsibilities. And that our choices and our responsibilities are a way of us expressing our closeness to God. Well, as we in 2025 reflect on harmony, I want to suggest that it's not that Saul is wrong and David is right. It's more complicated than that. In fact, harmony flourishes between the two trees. Second, from the beginning of time, the ancestors of our faith tradition have called upon God to intervene, to take revenge on our behalf. And as a people spanning this whole time period up until today, we have communally and personally, we've spent many hours sitting under the tamarisk tree hoping that God will do some mighty deed to save us. And in fact, some of our sacred stories tell of God's intervention. In this psalm, though, we notice a new awareness growing. And it's an awareness that began growing during the axial period. It's the awareness of personal choice that humans have to follow God. We see that God does not limit what Saul can do in the grips of evil and madness. Nor does God predetermine David's success. No, David will have to use all of his resources, all of his skills, and his personal sense of agency. What we read in both the story in 1 Samuel and in this psalm is that you and I, we must use all the resources that we have for good in this world. And God is always present, working for good in times of trouble. The answer lies between the two trees. Well, third, we can read this psalm like holding up a mirror to our human heart. The psalm invites us to recognize that all of us have the tendency to trust in riches and to feel protected by power. We all, as human beings, tend to lean towards feeling entitled to God's generosity, like we are the only ones on God's side. And the human heart has the capacity to take refuge in following the goodness of the path of Jesus that we have chosen. To look for the goodness that is growing in ourselves that mirrors the God and the teacher that we serve. And then, out of seeing that goodness within ourselves, to look out at the world through that lens. And to see the goodness in others, no matter their faith tradition, their power, their riches, their vulnerability, or their poverty. The challenge lies between the two trees. Fourth, we recognize that as human beings, we have the natural tendency to shift responsibility and to quickly point our finger and blame others. We don't want to be on the side of those who are wrong or those who have done wrong. We have the tendency to believe that we are doing our best, but that others are not. To turn away from the idea that we are a part of systems, just as human beings living on this earth, that we are a part of systems that have caused hurt to others. And human beings have the great capacity to feel spiritually rooted and safe in the presence of God. And it's this sense of groundedness, this sense of safety that allows us to humbly state, as David did, that whether intentionally or unintentionally, we have been part of systems in our churches and in our country that have caused others great harm. As a minister, I hope that I never have intentionally caused anyone harm, and yet I know that as someone who's participated in the systems in place in the church, and as someone who has participated in systems in the place in our country, that I have been a part of causing great harm. And I can humbly say, I take responsibility. And hopefully, my friends, as we soften and as we embrace humility, that those who have resistance because they are afraid of us, that they will begin to trust our words when we humbly and very honestly say, we take responsibility. We are responsible. Come, be with us. You will be safe with us. The difference is felt between the two trees.